I think so. Yeah, it's good. Thank you very much, Kat. So, bhakti, bhakti as a religious, hey, Shanti, oi, ji. Bhakti as a spiritual, historical, religious, cross-cultural, global phenomena rises up and gets popularized in different places at different times. In essence, bhakti is the idea that there's an omnipotent and omnibenevolent source of all creation, an omnipotent and omnibenevolent being who is the source of all creation. And that being is capable of love, and being all-loving, omnibenevolent, is actually filled with love, and wants the best for you. And that your spiritual life fundamentally consists of reaching out to. Can you just let them know that it's like a full disturbance? The sound of their voice as well as the machinery they're using, both are a disturbance. Given that God is filled with love and wants the best for you, that really spiritual life consists of, in a regulated way, in a regular way, in a conscientious and sincere manner, spiritual life consists of opening yourself up to God's grace. And so in a bhakti tradition, prayer will be highlighted and focused on. And prayer that doesn't ask for anything in return also shows up. Prayer just for the sake of prayer, glorification of God's grace just for its own sake, devoid of what's in it for you or devoid of asking for anything in return. I'm just going to start again, just for my own sake. There's been enough disturbances where I feel like I need to start again. Bhakti is a global phenomenon. And hey, Hare Krishna, could we close that door? Thanks. Somehow the sun is right there, so if she opens it's like boom. I can tolerate it, but the noise and that all at once, it's tough for me. Yeah, bhakti is a global phenomenon. It's not limited just to India. And not just to the Hare Krishna movements all over the world. Bhakti in Judaism and Christianity, in different religious, even in Buddhism. It crops up. It's this global phenomenon. And if you understand bhakti, then you can spot it when you see it, irrespective of the trappings of a particular religion where it's rising up. It really does represent a global phenomenon in religious evolution. You know, things start off with animism. Essentially, people worship trees and mountains and rivers and stuff like that. Powerful displays of you know, a higher power governing the world. And you know, you end up personifying things like gravity and precipitation, the water cycle. It all gets personified. And so you start to pray to a river, and pray to the rain clouds, and pray to powerful mountains. That's called animism. It's generally considered to be like the lowest rung in the evolution, humankind's evolution towards religion. That would be like the lowest rung. And then the highest rung is usually considered to be monotheism. Now, this is a little bit Eurocentric in the sense that the European colonialist mindset is that Christianity is the way to go, and therefore Christianity must be the apex of religious expression, and the Aboriginal beginning expressions of native tribes in their, you know, indigenous lands prior to, you know, Western philosophy coming and washing over them with its purifying effect. Those things would be the lowest rung. So, you know, when the British or whatever European country was colonizing a group, they would walk in and they would dismiss as lower, as less evolved, as pre-philosophical other forms of religious expression. Do you follow this? And it's not entirely without merit. I mean, a lot of times you get pre-philosophical religious traditions, and you like, why are you sacrificing human children? And they're like, you know, to stop the eclipse from swallowing the sun. And you're like, but it happens anyway, and you know, it's just an eclipse. And then they're like, okay, well, you know, the gods want blood sacrifice. You're like, what's your logic? Like, I don't know. The priest told us to do this. So you do get stuff like that where it's pre-philosophical. It's just there's a ritual and there's not much behind it, and it becomes relatively blind, and obviously some really bad stuff can ensue. Of course, Christianity is also a massive cannibal cult, blood sacrifice cult, where Jesus becomes the Lamb of God, and somehow you got to kill a lamb for Passover, and now you got to do a human sacrifice, and you got to wear a cross representing that sacrifice, and you eat the body and blood of Christ ritually every day in the form of the wafer and the blood and the grape juice. So Christianity itself has a bunch of super bizarre stuff that, you know, has a hard time escaping some kind of philosophical scrutiny, despite the fact that there's a whole philosophy behind it. But anyway, you get this evolution from animism, where you look at a tree and a stone, and you see that as being a sign of a higher power, like gravity and rain and lightning and the sun and heat and fire. These massive, like, powerful phenomena that govern our life and really make life possible. The change of seasons and stuff like that. That all gets personified. And then you end up worshiping those things to keep the ball rolling. Do you understand? Do you understand or not? Yeah? Because you look confused. Okay. I'm always curious whether you're confused or not. You have this vexed look on your face. I don't know. And then that evolves. Usually into polytheism, where you got a bunch of different gods. Below a certain age, they get a pass. My problem is when you guys start doing stuff like that. Yeah, then you get this polytheism, where you worship many gods. Hinduism is generally thought of as being a polytheistic religion. It's really not. It's a misnomer. It's a mislabel. You know, if you were to go and meet with a Catholic, and they had a ton of different statues of their various saints in their temple, and you were to say to them, oh, you must be polytheists because you have all these statues of all your saints, and you have Or even if you went to a Protestant church, and you're like, oh, you have a Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. You must all be polytheists. And actually, Muhammad thought that. Lots of Christians got killed by Muhammad and his followers because he felt that Christians had become polytheists and had broken from the Abrahamic rule of only one God. And so, what to speak of anthropomorphism, Jesus getting elevated to the position of being God incarnate, although he gets murdered and killed on the cross and actually dies. That's a whole nother one you got to wrap your head around. And really there were two positions. One is that Jesus was God, and the other one was that he was human. And so when they voted on it, they just said it was going to be both, and that became known as the hypostatic union. But I think in a lot of ways it was just their inability to reconcile two philosophically divergent traditions, and so they syncretistically put them together without bothering to notice that they don't actually make sense. Did you guys follow this? Anyway, so if you went to a church or a mosque, or not so much a mosque, although they do bow down to a black rock 5 times a day, but if you went to a church and you saw a bunch of different icons, especially a Catholic church, but even you go just down, like, I guess that's all Catholic down there too. In Mexico, it gets really tribal. They have a bunch of indigenous stuff that gets mixed in with their Catholicism. And the popes just let it go because it was too much to try to break the tribal, native, indigenous traditions from Catholicism, so they went for it. Even the whole thing of Easter eggs, it's totally pagan. It's totally pagan, and the Christians just rolled with it, decided not to make a big deal out of it. The Easter bunny, fertility, it's all super pre-Christian pagan roots. But they can only fight so much, and so they don't want to make you give up everything, otherwise they end up getting kicked out. And so they just let stuff go. Like when Christianity went to India, they really got popular in South India, along the western seaboard, Kerala, because they came, I guess, around Africa and came up. They hit Mauritius and they hit India, that western seaboard, bottom part of it. And they converted a bunch of Christians. There's a bunch of Christians even now in Kerala. But they tried to say, okay, no more casteism. And the way they tried to promote no casteism is they had everyone come together on the feast days of the Catholic saints to eat in the church a feast and break bread together. But different castes in India don't eat together. You may not know this, but even you're Indian, you might not know this because you just don't know. Things have changed in the last 20, 30 years. But even in pious Hindu society today, you don't eat with people from different communities. You stick to your own, especially when it comes time to breaking bread. And so they try to get everybody to come together, the high and the low caste together in the church for the saints' feast. You know, like you have a feast. And they just converted back to Hinduism. It was such a big ask. It ran so much against their grain that over that social system, they were willing to change back to their original religion. And there was a papal decree in like 1800s giving permission to maintain the caste system within Catholicism in India, because they realized they weren't going to do any proselytizing and evangelizing if they didn't keep with the basic system. Even the whole thing of Jesus, like who looks like a handsome white man on a cross, that's of course ridiculous. But even forget the whole the whitewashing of Jesus. He becomes like a member of the Aryan Brotherhood or something like that. Forget that. You end up with a Nordic deity. Even just the idea of Jesus suffering on the cross as like this peaceful person, like this, the Lamb of God, that whole sweet idea about Jesus, just turn the other cheek and forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That was not the way Christianity spread amongst the Germanic hordes. They were all barbarians. And so there's a bunch of different groups. There's the Saxons, and then the different, Visigoths. There's a whole bunch of different groups. They weren't all just one tribe. There's a whole bunch of them. But the Celts, it's a whole group, all sorts of different ones. Anyway, when Christianity spread there, they were all warriors. And so Christianity for centuries was all about Jesus was a warrior who fought death and defeated death in battle. And King Christ fought and destroyed death. And therefore you should worship him and also become undefeatable in battle. Very different than the Jesus that we meet. Anyway, so if you were to go to a Catholic church and ask them about all the different statues and say you must be polytheists, they would say, no, of course we're not polytheists. Of course, we just believe in one God. These are just different facets or manifestations or so on and so forth. And they would explain it. And because they're a philosophical tradition, they have a theology, and they can speak coherently about their belief system. Then you move on to pantheism, which is essentially nature worship, but the more philosophical variety is that everything becomes God, everything is divine. Usually with an impersonal spin to it. If it's too much nature worship, then it just becomes animism. So it has to have this sort of collective, there's one spirit or one force tying everything together. Then it becomes more pantheistic. It's more of a philosophical tradition, actually. Then that gets into other varieties. You have deism, that God starts the world, but then the world operates all on its own, and you can arrive at God naturally through just looking at there's kind of two variations. One is that God has nothing to do with the world, is a purely transcendent being, and the world runs by regular laws, but there's also a deity. Of course, they don't give any evidence for why there would be a deity. If you can explain everything materially, there'd be no need for a deity. It becomes a ghost in the machine. And the other side of deism is the idea that you can logically look at the world and come to the conclusion that there's a God even without any scripture, like a natural theism. Then you got panentheism, the idea that everything is divine, but it's within the deity. And God is more than merely immanent, not just the world, but beyond the world as well. And therefore, when you look at the world, instead of looking at the world dualistically, where there's God and then there's Satan, and there's good and evil and heaven and hell and spirit and matter, you look at the world in a more complete way where everything comes from the divine and everything is connected to God. And at the same time, you won't find a complete picture within this world, because God is both immanent in this world and transcendent beyond this world. The first iteration of that is the Vedic Upanishads. That's our tradition, the last one I just mentioned. The term panentheism only got coined in the 1800s by the guy who founded the University of Indiana, because I know fun facts like that. And so, it's a relatively new idea in Western thought, but it's been around for thousands of years in Indic thought. And then you have monotheism. I mean, you've got other stuff too. You've got monolatry. There's many gods, but only one deserves to be worshipped. And then you've got henotheism. There's many gods, but you can kind of pick and choose which one you want, but just that's enough. Polytheism. There's many different gods, and they're vying for control. That's why I would say Hinduism wouldn't really be polytheistic, to bring it back to my big long tangent. And so within polytheism, it's almost like the different deities are comic book superheroes. They have all sorts of personal problems, and they suffer from any number of different negative traits, and they also have superpowers. And they theoretically could be killed, and they're generally involved in some kind of big soap opera in the sky. And you end up supplicating to all of them to avoid messing up. And there's a fear that none of them are supreme, and therefore you got to be careful. Henotheism, you kind of either pick one as supreme. Kathenotheism, you move from one to another, and each one you worship you consider to be supreme. That Max Mueller came up with that when he experienced Hinduism, the famous German first Indologist. He came up with this because he couldn't figure out why Hindus would worship many gods but speak about them as if they were all the supreme. But modern day Hinduism, if it's not pre-philosophical, and really if it's pre-philosophical, it depends on the person you're talking to. So like if I ask you, why do you worship many gods? You're like, I don't know. My mom told me to. I'm afraid if I don't, maybe the house is going to fall down on me. Then that's pre-philosophical. Then you really are a polytheist. But most somewhat educated Hindus, if you ask them, why do you worship all the different gods? They'll say one of two things. They'll either say, no, we venerate all of them, but Krishna is supreme, or Shiva is supreme. They'll have an argument like that. Usually one of those two. Sometimes it's Shakti. The three main schools, Shakta, Shaiva, and Vaishnava. For sure, Vaishnava is the most popular. Over 70% of the world's Hindus are Vaishnavas. But the other 30%, you're still talking about hundreds of millions of people collectively. And so that would be Shaivas, especially in South India. You from South? No. You from South? Yeah. And then you have Shakti is worshipped throughout the subcontinent of India, north and south. But the community will be just smaller. You may even have a Kul Devata that you worship, like your Shakti deity in your family, but it's not really, it's like something you do, but it's not really, you're not considering that's the supreme. So if you ask a Hindu with a bunch of different pictures where they're putting a flower in front of each one of them, you'll usually get one of two answers. One of the answers could be, I don't know why, my grandmother told me to, and I'm afraid the house is going to fall down and the rain won't come if I don't do it. If that's, I'm going to lose my job, or my wife's going to leave me. If that's your answer, you're pre-philosophical, it's blind faith, and you really are a polytheist. If even that, you might just be a ritualist who has no idea what's going on. But if you're educated, you're going to give one of two answers. And that's going to either be, we venerate all of them, but there's only one supreme. And that is, insert the name of what conception of divinity your community thinks is supreme. The other answer will be, everything is one. These are just different manifestations of the one. But ultimately, Brahman is supreme, devoid of any features. And we're just, so we can make some connection, then we're worshiping this. But we don't think these are actually distinct gods vying for supremacy, or that one of them is necessarily God and the rest are subordinates, demiurges. We actually think everything is just one. You'll usually get one of those two answers out of a philosophical Hindu. Neither of those answers are polytheistic. So the whole idea in Western comparative religion that Hinduism is polytheistic is just dramatically false. It's a really poor, piercing into the religious traditions of ancient India. So anyway, you've got animism, where you're worshiping the forces of nature, big rocks, big trees, big mountains. You see that with Tulsi in our tradition, by the way, and also our worship of Mother Ganga. It's not like we don't have all this stuff in a super cool way. But you've got animism, then you've got pantheism, nature worship, but a little more sophisticated, a little more there's one force that combines them all, usually impersonal. You got polytheism, which is a bunch of comic book heroes who hate each other, and you got to be careful. Then you've got panentheism, deism, I explained, which is either natural theism or God has nothing to do with this world, purely transcendent. You got panentheism, which tries to match up the immanence and the transcendence of the deity. And then you get to monotheism, which is that there's one deity. And that monotheism, like I said, has a couple of precursors. Henotheism, kathenotheism, and monolatry become the precursors. You can leave that door open, please. Thank you. And that's just sort of, that's like the Western system of categorization in academic circles for how you look at the different religions of the world and you understand who's who and what's what. And it's not a bad taxonomy, just like if you look at the Western, fauna and flora, they do a really good job of taxonomizing all biological life, and so they did the same thing with religion. There's value in it. They just might have mislabeled a few of the traditions in the world. Within the idea that there's one deity, that there's one source of everything, which the Europeans weren't all bad. That was a good one they came up with. Actually, the Jews came up with that. The Jews were really the first monotheists in the polytheistic Babylonian world in the Middle East. That's their tradition, that there's one deity. And so the Vaishnavas are the equivalent in India, that there's one source of everything, and that source is personal and loving and powerful. And therefore, what you really just need to do is you need to cry out to God and not ask for anything in return. God knows what you need. You don't need to make a big Christmas list or a big laundry list for God to do. You can just humbly bow down and be peaceful and cry out and commune. And that phenomena within the evolution of religion is called bhakti. And it shows up everywhere. And so bhakti religions in any part of the world are going to do a lot of kirtan. Now, it might not be the kirtan that we're familiar with. It might be Gregorian chants or something like that. But they're going to have a lot of prayer, a lot of meditation, a lot of praying without asking for anything. Those people are going to tend to not be very materialistic. They're going to tend to make the goal of their life connecting with God above all things. That's the bhakti phenomena. And that phenomenon has been around for a long time. Shows up in the Upanishads in ancient India. You can even find it in the old Veda, the original Rig Veda. Definitely in the Upanishads, definitely in the Puranas and the Agama literature. You find it all throughout the millennium. And then you get these resurgences of bhakti that come up. Like 1,000 years ago, even more, 1,200 years ago, there was a massive resurgence in South India with the Alwars, the South Indian bhakti saints who changed the landscape of southern India forever. They wrote in Sanskrit, but they also wrote in Tamil. And their writings are revered by their followers, and there's huge, tens of millions of Vaishnavas in South India, still to this day, that came from these Alwars. We study their books. Their elucidations on bhakti they just marry up with us perfectly. To give you a simple example of bhakti, two stories from one of the Alwars. It's two stories. You'll know the stories, but you probably didn't know where they came from. So here are two simple stories to illustrate the nature of bhakti from South India. Ram was building his bridge to Lanka. If you don't know what I'm talking about, tough luck. Ram was building his bridge to Lanka, and Hanuman was carrying big, big stones, throwing them into the water with the name Ram inscribed on them, and they were floating. And then some squirrel was throwing little tiny pebbles. And there was some idea that the squirrel should just get out of the way and let Hanuman do the heavy lifting. And Ram said, no, I value both things the same. The squirrel is doing their best to worship me, you're doing your best, and that's all I care about. Gaur Govinda Maharaj, one of the greatest Vaishnavas that I was ever able to see, passed away in 1995 of his own volition, speaking about Radha and Krishna's glories in Mayapur. Picked his death day and just went out speaking about Radha and Krishna's glories. Gaur Govinda Maharaj, he had so many Western disciples, and the rule was if you were married and you were a Westerner, if you were a Grihastha, you had to give him half of whatever money you made. And so his disciples would come with lakhs and lakhs of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and put it at his feet. One of the richest families in India offered to build him a temple. The Hinduja family met him in London and said, Maharaj, we want to build you a temple. Maharaj said, I don't need your money. My disciples will build. Refused huge money from the richest family, the Hinduja family, multi-billionaires, many times over. Definitely one of the 10 richest families in the world. He refused their money. And just had a bunch of 22-year-olds, building his temples for him. Didn't want the money from the outsiders. And then one time, one of his he's from Odisha, Gauravinda Maharaj. Odisha's one of the poorest states in all of India. Maybe now, I don't know. Jharkhand is up there. Nagaland is up there. There's a few others that have some. You can make an argument. I'm not sure. I have to look at the domestic production of each of the places to figure out. But Odisha is definitely in the lowest three. It's definitely going to be in the lowest three. One of his disciples came and gave him a few hundred rupees. So all the other disciples were there giving him lakhs and lakhs of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this disciple came with just a few hundred rupees and gave it to him and was very ashamed. And he apologized for giving so little. And Gauravinda said, I see crores in front of me. A crore is 10 million. 10 million. I said crores and crores in front of me. Because that disciple had a good mood and was offering from his heart. That's very much of a bhakti idea. That you just surrender to Krishna and that's enough. It's very much of a bhakti ideal. In a little anecdote. Here's another one. There was a bird, a sparrow, who foolishly laid her eggs on the beach and they got washed away by the tide. And so the sparrow began going out into the water. This is from one of the Alwars. 1,000 years ago. 8 centuries ago, I can't remember, but it's from his, and we tell the story ourselves. That's how amazing it is, how infectious the story is. The sparrow began going out in the ocean and picking up water from the ocean and taking it on the land and then dumping it out and was going back and forth. And Garuda, who's like the deity of all birds, saw this sparrow doing this day in and day out and came down from Vaikuntha and said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I lost my eggs, so I'm going to dry up the ocean. Which is obviously a fool's errand. 1 million sparrows could spend 1 billion years, they wouldn't dry up the ocean. Not only because there's a water table and the water they were putting on the earth just goes back underground in the ocean, not just because of that, but also because of that. And the water cycle and so many things. And then Guru said, oh, you want to do this? I'm going to help you. And the Guru told the ocean, hey, I'm going to start drying you up too. I'm going to start picking your water up in my beak. And all of a sudden the eggs came out. The next wave came in and the eggs wound up on the sand. The ocean did not want Garuda interceding on behalf of this little sparrow. That's another bhakti story. That if you reach out to Krishna just a little bit with just your little small heart and your little offering of love, that's really all that's required for miracles to occur and for Krishna to become intimately involved in your life and helping you. They're the notions they're what happens when you think about an all-powerful, all-good deity and what that all-powerful, all-good deity would want from you. So our tribe is a bhakti renaissance tradition from 5 centuries ago in Odisha, on the eastern Indian seaboard, located roughly where Virginia Beach is located in the U.S. It's a little seaside town. It's a tourist destination. And a bunch of devotees gathered there about 5 centuries ago, headed by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And they began yet another bhakti renaissance. Like the one that had hit South India 8 centuries before, and like the ones that have been hit in India for thousands of years, and have hit in other places of the world, like with Judaism. These radical bhakti traditions. And their tradition is our tradition. Chant Krishna's name. Ask for nothing. Don't even chant a prayer. Don't even chant Om Krishnaya Namaha. My respects to Krishna. Don't even do it. Just cry out Krishna's name. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Just chant Krishna's name. Not even kirtan, nam kirtan. Not even mantra, nam seva. Just chant the name of God over and over again. Don't even ask for anything. Don't ask for anything. Doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. That's a radical concept even today, where there's still a disparity between the sexes. What to speak of 5 centuries ago in Muslim-ruled India. Doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. Doesn't matter whether you're a high or low caste. Remember that thing I said about South India and they reverted back? That's not a small statement to make 5 centuries ago in a very, very stratified society. Hinduism has the most aggressive affirmative action on the planet. It's called a system of reservations. They have scheduled castes and tribes. And, they have seats in parliament reserved for people from particular castes. That's how seriously they take it. The equivalent in the U.S. would be if we said, there have to be X amount of black people in Congress at all times. You follow? X amount of seats in Congress are reserved for black people and for Mexican people, and white people need not apply. They can't even run. Gives you an idea of how aggressive. And that's since the 40s, when Ambedkar, who himself was a Dalit, the lowest caste, he became the Supreme Court Justice of India. They had a bunch of Muslim prime ministers, which is also totally radical. How did they come up with that? The Muslims represent such a small portion, 10% of the Indian population, but yet they've still had prime ministers who are Muslims. So, it doesn't matter what caste you are. It doesn't matter what sex you are. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter if you're a Brahmin. We'll even accept Muslims in our ranks. They came up with this idea 5 centuries ago on a seashore in Jagannath Puri. The Hare Krishna movement is the reverberation of that nuclear bomb that went off 5 centuries ago. One of our acharyas said Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a golden volcano of divine love. Like a golden volcano erupted in Jagannath Puri of divine love, of Krishna prema, of this really high, very far out, amazing, miraculous idea. The idea itself is a miracle. That the purpose of human life is to love God with your whole heart and soul. That God's available for the price of a song. That you don't need to do anything other than give your heart to Krishna. That's the purpose of life. That's fundamentally written on your heart. That's your purpose of existence. And Krishna is always intimately available to you at every moment. And all you need to do is right now just cry out, that's enough. Don't need to change anything else. Don't need to become a big sannyasi or a big pundit or renounce the world or move to the Himalayas or go to a monastery or give a big donation or build a big temple or any of that. Just cry out to Krishna. That's enough. Because Krishna is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, and that's all he requires from you. We also have a female conception of God as well. We got the whole Radha Krishna thing. There's all sorts of bells and whistles I'm skipping over for the sake of time. But that explosion took place it was 2 communities. It was West Bengal and Odisha. And so the Gaudiyas and the Udiyas. Gauda Desh is the old name for Bengal. The Gaudiyas and the Udiyas from Odisha. Those 2 communities came together. And their Pitam, their Jerusalem, their Mecca was Jagannath Puri. Technically we got 3 Meccas, Navadvip, Mayapur, and Jagannath Puri. Navadvip, Vrindavan, and Jagannath Puri. But 5 centuries ago, it all went down in Jagannath Puri. And so what's going on in Jagannath Puri? There is a deity of Jagannath, this huge, massive, 20-foot high wood, aniconic to some extent statue that doesn't look like any deity you ever see in India. It's just a big face. It's like those happy face stickers you see, but we worship him as a deity. And there's Jagannath, Baladev, and Subhadra. black, white, and yellow. And that deity of Krishna worshipped according to the style of Jagannath, these Jagannath devotees, these pandas who've been living there, and the Shabara community, the Daita community, who've been worshiping there for centuries. Somehow it attracted our tradition, and they all showed up there. So the tradition already existed. You follow? The tradition already existed. Like in 1992, I was in Mumbai. There was big riots in 1992. Who was in India in 1992 for the riots? What were the riots about? Huh? Where? That's right, in Ayodhya, a Hindu place of pilgrimage associated with Ram. The Muslims came in, broke the temple, built a mosque. Then the Hindus, centuries later, once there were television cameras around, went back and broke the mosque and wanted to construct a Hindu temple. And that made people freak out. And the Muslims don't do well in riots with Hindus, simply because they're outnumbered 7-1. And so it just never goes well for them. And so it was a bad day for the Muslims. Of course, the Muslims had the worst genocide in the history of human society. They killed 100 million Hindus over 1,000 years. Starting just 50 years after Muhammad passed away, it was the first incursion into India. And they ruled until the British took over. So, it's not like Hindus haven't suffered their fair share as well. But this time in 1992, and so that happens sometimes. One religion will come in and say, oh, your holy place is now our holy place. So in a nice way, we did that in Jagannath Puri. They already had a system of worship. We said, we like what you guys are doing so much, it's going to become our system. So now the main deities in the Hare Krishna movement are Jagannath, Baladev, and Subhadra. How do you know that? Because they're on every ISKCON temple. See that? See the painting? You see that? They do this in our whole system. What I'm about to share with you guys comes from them. So the cult of Jagannath. Jagannath means Lord of the world. It's where you get the English word juggernaut from. Juggernaut was what happened when Christians came to India and saw the Rath Yatra. They were so disgusted by the way we worship the deity of Jagannath that they coined the term juggernaut to refer to an evil, malefic force that crushed everything in front of it. And to get money from all the pious, they used to say that pilgrims were killing themselves and that babies were being killed and thrown under the wheels of the chariot. It's totally false. It's not actually true. But they said that because then they would get money. Missionaries would get money. Because English pious Christians would hear that story and pour money into the colonization of India. And so, if you read this, they talk about they're cooking babies on the side of the road and eating their flesh. It's like the story that these are like pious Hindu people who are like the cleanest people on the planet, and they're all vegan. But they're saying this kind of stuff to get money. A bunch of flesh-eating, alcohol-drinking Westerners who are plundering and raping the country at that same time, under the veil of civilizing it. But anyway, there's this system there of worship. So Jagannath, Baladev, and Subhadra are huge deities, and they're made out of wood, so they have to be replaced every so often, which is a whole other thing we're not going to talk about. But once a year, the deities leave the temple and go on a 12-day pilgrimage to another temple. And the whole year is spent building these 40-foot high chariots that are pulled by ropes with wooden wheels with no screws. They're built according to an old system which has been around for centuries of like a lock and joint kind of fitting thing. And they're made fresh every year. All that wood gets recycled and used for the fire, for cooking for the deities. The deities eat 50 times a day. So you figure if the worship goes on from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m., so you're looking at whatever that's 3 a.m. to 5, let's say 9 p.m. So you're looking at 18 hours of worship. So you're looking at like 3 offerings an hour. The whole city is built around the temple. There's a temple, and it's like the city comes out like the old radio cities, where there's a radio tower and the city would be built around it. Like Washington D.C., you have a beltway. You have these beltways. They have the same thing in Phoenix, where they have a circular freeway because the city grew out organically like that. So the whole city is built around the Jagannath temple. And everybody there is a devotee of Jagannath. And they're all getting ready for this once-a-year festival called Yatra, which we'll be celebrating in a little bit of a synopsized way next week. And the deity comes out of the temple, which is a huge thing, because the deity weighs hundreds and hundreds of pounds. They have to get these dozens of big, strong... the guy who won the Mr. India bodybuilding competition is a Daita. He's one of the pujaris from that temple. He's huge, muscular guy. And they pick up the deity, and they have these big pillows, and they bounce the deity from one pillow to another to get it up on the chariot. They have a whole system for how they do it. It takes them hours and hours and hours. It's a whole thing. But prior to that, 15 days prior to that, on the full moon day, in the month of May, June, the month of Jeshta, which is calculated on the lunar calendar, so it takes place in May or June of our calendar. And they have a Snan Yatra, which is what we're celebrating just now. So here's what happens in the Snan Yatra. The deities leave the temple again. They leave the temple again. And so they move the deities to the outer wall of the temple where they set up a huge 80-foot stage. And the deities get installed up there for a couple of days. And they have a well that they only pull water from one time a year. And they pull water from that well, and they put a bunch of auspicious ingredients in that water, and they bathe the deity with 108 kalashes from this well that's only used for this bathing ceremony. It's on the property. You get this sometimes. You'll get like it's a Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan. They have a well that's only used for the deities. They have cows that are only used for the deities. And it's in the temple compound. They have a few cows. 15 feet from the deities, they have a goshala. 15, 20 feet from the deities, they have a well. And they've just been using that water for centuries, and that's the water for the deity. So they have a well at the Puri temple in the compound. And they pull the water from this well, and they bathe the deity. It's a wood deity, so it totally messes up the paint. Totally messes up the paint. They bathe the deity, and then it starts the Anavasara. Avasara means like an auspicious moment. It means like literally in Sanskrit means things have fallen into place. Ava means kind of down, and Sara means flowing. And so when things flow downwards perfectly and they fall into place, that in Sanskrit is called avasara. And anavasara means things have not fallen into place. It's a bad situation. And what's the bad situation? You don't get to see the deity. It's also called anasar, but it's actually the Sanskrit term is anavasara. You don't get to see the deity. So for 15 days, nobody in Jagannath Puri gets to go see the deity, but the whole town goes and sees the deity every day. But for 15 days, they don't get to go. There's another temple called Alarnath. They go to that temple. And they also make a patachitra. They take a piece of cotton and they put plaster on the cotton. It's not like actual plaster, it's granite powder mixed with boiled tamarind, and they make a paste out of it. And then they put that on the cotton cloth, and it becomes hard. And then they paint on that, and it's a very special style of art. It's really famous from Puri. Like it's a style of art that's become popular. Like one of the most famous places where they do it is called Raghurajpur. Is in Odisha as well. It's a famous town where they do the style of art. You can buy the style of art. It's become a thing. It's like very indigenous art. And so they make a deity of Jagannath, a deity of Baladev, and a deity of Subhadra on a painting, and they install that painting when they remove the deity. So you see what we're doing here? They're the same thing. So the deity's removed, the painting's installed, so you can come to the temple and see the painting. Or there's another temple people go to for 15 days, and then after that's over, you have the Netrotsav. You have the festival for the eyes where Jagannath reappears, and that's the Rath Yatra festival where he goes on his chariot and goes out. So this happens every year in Puri. And there's months and months of preparation. And it's kind of like their whole calendar year is based on how this festival happens. Oh, and then there's the Gajavesh or Hastivesh, And so there's the, while they're up on that Snan Bedi, the bathing platform, where they live for a couple days, they dress them in this gold, silver armor, where all you see is Jagannath's face, and he's completely covered all the way around in this gold and silver armor. And it is Gajavesh. He's dressed like an elephant, and it has a little snout on it too. They try and say it's Ganesh. He's dressed like Ganesh, but that's just somebody just made that up. It's not there in like any. It's not the actual tradition. And so he's dressed like an elephant because kings are elephants and lions. That's the two animals were like spirit animals of kings. So it's a way of honoring Jagannath by dressing him very opulently. Subhadra gets dressed like a lotus. So they each have their. So Baladev and Jagannath, they get dressed in this Gajavesh. It's a really you can get pictures of it on the internet if you want to see it. And then Subhadra's dressed in a lotus armor outfit. So you get that darshan, you get to see them get bathed, and then they get sick because they got a bath. It was too hot because it's the middle of summer. Jeshta is the middle of summer. It's before the monsoons come. So it was too hot. So they bathed them with 108 vessels of water. But then bathing them with so much water got them sick, and then they have to disappear. And then they have the Raj Vaidya, the king's Ayurvedic Kaviraj. He comes and administers medicine to Jagannath for 15 days. And Jagannath survives on a diet of sandesh. And of course, I don't think sandesh is actually very good for health. But it's like an Ayurvedic thing. Somehow they think like dairy is going to cure you of a cold. I don't think they need to think about it a little bit more. But they give him sandesh, and they give him fruits, and they make teas and herbal concoctions, and they feed the deity. So we do that too. For 14 days, or for 1 week, we're doing it kind of in a bridge format this year. The deity won't be visible. You'll just see that painting. And for us, it's a big deal, because we're used to seeing the deity every day. And so the deity has been sequestered in another place, and then we worship the deity. We just give him khichdi. So we give him some khichdi, and we give him some fruits, and we give him hot tea. And he doesn't get to eat any of the fancy stuff that the other deities get to eat because he's sick. And we dress him up in blankets and warm clothes, and we conduct all of his worship separately. And during that time period, we also paint the deity. So if there's any repairs to our Jagannath, Baladev, and Subhadra deities, we then paint them at this time. So that'll happen in the next few days. And then we have the Rath Yatra festival. Now, Rath Yatra is all about a parade. It's just a bad optic to do a parade nowadays, because any gathering of people in public is frowned upon because of the pandemic. So we're not going to do a full-blown parade, but we're going to have the deities come out in the temple and go through a parade around the temple. And in that way, we're going to at least honor the tradition, even though we can't do the full Rath Yatra like we normally do. So slightly smaller Anavasara, slightly smaller Rath Yatra, but the same thing that they do in Puri, we're doing here. Right up to the Patachitra, and the painting, Snan, that's their bathing platform, they'll come out. Usually we let everybody bathe. But again, because of COVID, just the pujaris are going to bathe. Then they'll be sequestered. And, in a bhakti tradition, you want to miss Krishna, because the only price for seeing God is that you love him enough and you want to see him. That's the only price. And so within our tradition, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu placed a real premium on cultivating the fine and lost art and science of missing Krishna. And so our prayers are generally prayers of longing, the way you might long for a lost lover and someone who's been taken away from you. And it softens your heart and nostalgizes your feelings for them and really brings them very powerfully into your consciousness. And so we cultivate missing Krishna. We don't actually think Krishna gets sick. If you get advanced enough, you might actually think he gets sick. But we're not in the post-philosophical stage. We have a post-philosophical stage. It's called Leela. It's another conversation. We have a post-philosophical stage where you forget everything you learned in the philosophical stage and you just become one of Krishna's friends in Vaikuntha, and you live forever. But in the philosophical stage, you don't misunderstand that Krishna gets sick. In the pre-philosophical stage, you might think he's sick. In the post-philosophical stage, you might think he's sick. But in the philosophical stage, we explain through Siddhanta and Tattva that that's not the case. But in a tradition where we value Leela, where we value an intimate relationship with God, where we want to embrace and kiss Krishna, where we want to dance with Krishna, there's incredible value in missing Krishna. And so the whole festival is set up to create an environment where we can miss Krishna strongly and become purified by that. Actually, there was a king, he married a Muslim, which is a super big no-no in Hinduism, especially back then in the 17th century, in the 18th century. And so once he married a Muslim, he was no longer allowed to go into the Jagannath temple because people with broken castes are not allowed into the Jagannath temple. So I couldn't go in the Jagannath temple. Maybe if I got a crazy tan, I do tan pretty well, maybe I could get in. If I really got really dark, I might be able to pull it off. Put a chadar over my head, wipe off my Gaudiya tilak so they don't know who I am. Maybe I could get in there. But in general, it's tough as a Westerner to get in there. And if you're Catholic, Muslims can't go in there. And if you married a Muslim, you can't go in there. They still follow this rule to the day. So this king couldn't go and see Jagannath anymore, which was a serious problem because he was the king of Puri. So he was the king of the city of Puri. So Jagannath is his deity. And so they made a painting of Jagannath at the door of the temple. So right by the door, what's called the Simhadwar, the lion door, like again, lions and elephants. Right by the Simhadwar, just on the right side of it, there's a huge painting of Jagannath's face that gets worship all day, every day. So anybody on the street who can't go in the temple can sit there and they can see that deity. You can also see the Nil Chakra. There's a blue, oxidized, precious metal, massive 35-foot diameter chakra on top of the temple. They have to climb 200 feet up to the chakra every day to tie flags on the chakra. Every day they do it. A bunch of guys climb up every single day. Whatever that is. What is that? 15, 20 stories almost? Like almost 20 stories up, they climb. And then tie flags on. If you can't go and see the temple, you can see that chakra and the flags, or you can see the image of Jagannath at the door of the temple. And in this way you can see the deity. And so even they removed that image. So nobody gets to see Jagannath. And then they replace it with a different image. So everybody gets a painting in lieu, even when it's a painting that's there in the first place, they remove the original painting and put a secondary painting. So you get to see it, but you really miss the original painting that you would normally see, and the original deity you would normally see, and everybody cultivates a mood of separation. And so our whole ritual culture is built around this ritual culture that flourished in Jagannath Puri 5 centuries ago as part of a bhakti renaissance that took over eastern India and then eventually spread all over India and eventually spread all over the world, and that's the Hare Krishna movement. We're the reverberation of that initial movement that took place. And so we'll do kirtan, and then while we're doing kirtan, at the same time the pujaris will come out and they'll do the bathing ceremony, and you'll see them bathe Jagannath with all sorts of auspicious liquids. And then Jagannath will catch a cold, then he'll disappear, and then, of course, a lot of you only come to the temple once a week, so you won't notice it, but in your heart you can notice it. And then when you come back next week, in the middle of the kirtan, the deity will appear, and then we'll have gone through the same yearly ritual that pious Hindus, Vaishnavas have been going through in Jagannath Puri for 1,000 years, and we'll observe the same thing they've been doing. Okay. That's it. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.